All right, well, happy Friday, everyone. I'm just going to do an audio lecture today. Bad hair day, you know. So anyway, I do want to go over a few announcements. First of all, the World in Conversation, I don't think they've sent out emails yet, so if you haven't heard from them, you're not the only one. So don't worry about that yet. I did want to talk about where we're at in the class. Talking about conflict, war, and terrorism, and we'll probably continue that next week. I'm going to give a lecture on Africa, and I may have to finish today's lecture on Monday as well. So anyway, Monday we'll finish up on this topic and then move on to chapter 6, looking at inequality and wealth and so on. So the other big announcement is that I have uploaded the instructions for the final project. Your Canvas will look different than mine because you're not professors. But anyway, you'll see a module for group project information. There are the instructions and the PowerPoints for the public and private organizations. I gave that video lecture a couple of weeks ago. Just to kind of go over them briefly. So I'll go over the groups. You've been lumped into groups, and I'll go over that in a moment. But basically what you're doing is profiling an organization that's actually existing out there in the real world. So for the project, you're going to be focusing on organizations that try to address poverty. That'll be the same topic for every group. And essentially, you will be lumped into either a government organization, public sector, a nonprofit in the private sector, or a business, which is also in the private sector, but obviously for profit. I've got a project checklist that you'll go over, then an organizational profile that will help guide you. So each person from the group should choose a specific aspect of the organization profile to focus on, which I'll go over in a moment, such as, say, the financing or the history of the organization. And each student will write a one-page double-spaced summary of the organization profile. Very basic, does not need to be, in-depth necessarily. And then groups will work together to develop a PowerPoint. You may want to kind of distribute the work, maybe someone who puts it together, collects all the slides from the rest of the group. Maybe they won't have to do as much or something like that. So, I'll let you kind of figure that out on your own. But so, as I said, you're lumped into groups, and I'll go through those groups in a moment. But if you're in 1 through 10, you'll be profiling a public government organization. 11 through 19, a private nonprofit, non-governmental organization. Or if your group's 20 through 25, a private for-profit business. Let's see, and then you'll submit it through Turnitin. So the project checklist, this is, the basics, the presentation slides. Your factual depiction of the organization, and then, demonstrate how how this organization tries to address poverty. I say environmental problems there too, so but focus on poverty. Okay, so as I said, you'll divide up different aspects of this organization profile, and each person will write a one-page summary for that section. So here are the different choices. What is it? A basic description of the organization. One person could do the history of the organization. One could look at the size, how many people, how many facilities, is it global, national, that sort of thing. How is it financed or funded? What's its leadership structure? And then for the presentation, as I said, each of you will prepare two to three PowerPoint slides, kind of basically the same information that you're putting in the document, and then you'll upload those to Canvas, turn it in, and I'll go over that later on. So you can use any type for the presentation so long as it can be uploaded to Canvas. So a PowerPoint or even a PDF is fine. Make sure you have a title. each individual's name listed above those slides that they submit. Cite where you gathered the information. APA style is recommended. Most of the citations will probably come from the organization's website. That'll be the main source of most of this information. But feel free to use news or research articles if you find that they are useful. There are no requirements other than at least one citation of the group's website. So it's not, this is not a terribly difficult group project, but it will give you an idea of, the different types of organizations that we see. And then I'll have a module that I'll upload them all to towards the end of the class, and then you can look at them and see how other, for-profit, non-profit organizations try to address poverty. Okay, so that's the main announcements right now, and now moving into the lecture material, still on war and terrorism, as I said. If you remember, last time we had been kind of finished by talking about studies of tyrants, tyranny, and so on. Today I'll be kind of talking about a few things, a couple of events and, some things from the 20th century in history that are important for understanding how the international system of law developed, and how it developed after World War II, and for the most part has stayed relatively intact, but now may be under some threat. And I'll also talk about terrorism later on. So when we look at some of the atrocities of the 20th century, and basically a lot of atrocities, a lot of the reason that they're able to happen psychologically is because of this idea of dehumanization. So basically, people are described as, cockroaches or parasites or things like that, non-human creatures and so on. And so when someone is able to dehumanize another person or another group, then it becomes easier for people to subject them to, murder or whatever it might be. I like this quote by Audre Lorde: "Unless one lives and loves in the trenches, it is difficult to remember that the war against dehumanization is ceaseless." I had a friend who I was sort of debating with a few years ago, saying something about the the resurgence of Nazism, and he was like, "Nazism isn't a thing anymore." And I was just like, "Oh, you're not in the trenches, basically." Anyway, so as I said, Nazism is very much a thing. And, it's a complex ideology. One of the cornerstones of it is basically this hatred of certain groups that were, believed to be holding back Germany or the European Aryan nation, whatever it might be. One of the major conspiracies that is still popular today is this Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was created, as far as we know, by essentially the secret police of the Tsarist Russia. With this sort of, it was basically this conspiracy about, the global Jewish cabal that's, kind of running the world. And it became extraordinarily popular. I mean, the way it spread through, across the world, through conspiracy theories and so on. So anti-Semitism, provides a lot of, the history of anti-Semitism provides many examples of, atrocities being committed. When we think about Germany and, its descent into Nazism, we have to remember what it was coming out of. So there had been the, First World War, which had, ended disastrously for Germany, and also it destroyed the monarchy in Germany. And so Germany had a democracy for about 11 years before it went into the Nazi dictatorship. But this was called the Weimar period, the Weimar Republic, and this was the first republic in Germany. There's a fantastic show on Netflix right now called Babylon Berlin that kind of takes place in Weimar Germany. So Weimar Germany had you had exciting kind of nightclubs going on, cabaret shows. You had a lot of artistic movements happening. There's another good movie called Swing Kids about the swing dances, which were later outlawed by the Nazi Party. Fantastic movie, Swing Kids. Anyway, so the Weimar Republic was this time period where you had a lot of different groups, liberal, conservative, left-wing, right-wing, communist, fascist, and so on, competing for power in Germany. And so there was a lot of feelings against kind of this kind of liberal bohemian sort of atmosphere during the Weimar Republic. Kind of a backlash, basically. A fascinating book is Travelers in the Third Reich. It's basically the kind of journals of people that were tourists in Germany during the 1930s, before the war, basically. But it's very. I'm personally interested in how people come to, develop sort of genocidal beliefs and so on. And as I'll talk about when I talk about conflict in Africa next time. Well, to understand some of this, it helps by understanding daily life. And this is really what sociologists, when we think about these things, we're particularly interested in. We're interested in conflict and war and things like that on their own merits and whatnot. Merits is a weird word. But more so the mindsets, behind these phenomena. And when we look at Germany, this comes from this book called German Youth Bond or Free. It was published in 1946, as you see, with some very interesting illustrations. So what this book points out is that during the late 1800s and early 1900s in Germany, you had sort of this kind of response to industrialization. So, everyone was moving to the cities, artisan shops were being closed down to make room for factories, and so on and so forth. And so you had a lot of young people who, they're kind of like, would be like what we consider hippies today in the United States, just kind of living in the woods and, hiking and stuff like this. And as you see here in this picture, they started developing sort of pagan beliefs and interest in things like that, looking at warrior cultures as being something to gravitate toward and so on. So Nazism is often described as sort of this kind of scientific approach when we look at the extermination camps and so on. But there was also a sort of mystical element, at least in Germany at that time. And a lot of these ideas then coalesced into the Nazi Party. Which is very interesting. So, like I said, you go from sort of like hippies and so on, and then as they start growing up, they join the Nazi Party, and the idea youth shall be led by youth. So they could still be young and still have a lot of power. This is from a book for kids, talking about make sure you're spying on your neighbors, making sure that they're good Nazis and so on. And so this is just kind of from that same book, that kind of where sociologists went to Germany during the 1930s and chronicled just basically what he saw there, and this fascinating transition from all the young people, the Wandervogel as they were called, who were these hiking hippies and so on. They played guitars and stuff like that. And then just a few years later, they're wearing these clean-cut uniforms and marching in the streets and so on. So a lot of different ideas and ideologies that were kind of compounding together, and eventually came the Nazi movement. John Gray, a philosopher, generally kind of considered a pessimist. Some people consider him a realist. He has a book called The Silence of Animals on Progress and Other Myths. His basic argument is that, notions of continual progress are unscientific. We fall in and out of progress and so on. But he says the collective solidarity of Nazi Germany was sustained by the incessant creation of internal enemies. Gays, gypsies, and Jews were not only discriminated against, as they had been in the past, they were actively persecuted, and this was essential to the collective euphoria that was created by the Nazi regime. So the totalitarian systems, one of the reasons that they survive is that they have to, in some ways, make the horrible things they do palatable for the citizenry. So as he says, yet there can be no doubt that the suffering inflicted on Jews was an integral part of the happiness the Nazis succeeded in manufacturing in the rest of the population. In order to make it appetizing, the thin gruel of communal joy had to be richly spiced with cruelty. John Gray has a way with words. But he's a contemporary philosopher, but we can look at this memoir that was written in 1939 by a guy named Sebastian Kaufner. And he talks about this happiness that many of the Nazis felt. He says, it is said that the Germans are subjugated. That is only half true. They are also something else, something worse, for which there is no word. They are comraded, a dreadfully dangerous condition. They lived a drugged life in a dream world. They are terribly happy, but terribly demeaned, so self-satisfied, but so despicable and inhuman. They think they are scaling the highest mountains, when in reality they are crawling in a swamp. And many Germans were not aware of the extent to which the Nazi Party was exterminating Jewish people and others, but it was well known. It was not necessarily a secret, and people chose to look the other way, or were not aware of the scale, and as I said, chose not to do anything. If we look at Auschwitz, I think there's a lot of very interesting work going on regarding the Holocaust. At Penn State last summer, I was supposed to go to the Netherlands to work with the Anne Frank Foundation because we're setting up a program with them. And I was going to go and take a class there, and we were going to go to the International Criminal Court and so on. And then coronavirus came along. So maybe sometime when we're able to travel again. But this is kind of fascinating. So Auschwitz was the famous concentration camp in Germany. In Poland, but it was run by the Nazi Germany. And this researchers are trying to basically document where everybody is coming from. And so these are basically where the Jews who were killed at Auschwitz, where they came from. And as you see, they come from all over North Africa, all over Europe, and so on. We're coming to a time, too, when living survivors of the Holocaust are dying. There's about roughly around 350 to 400,000 of them left in the world, and many of them were fairly young when they were in the concentration camps. And so we're, estimating by, around 2035 to, by 2040, roughly, most of the Holocaust survivors, if not all of them, will have died. Now, that will be interesting. The former chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, pointed out a few years ago that, she said, once all of the survivors of the Holocaust are gone, then we'll know whether or not we've learned from history. I thought that was a very, very poignant statement. Now, when we talk about the concentration camps, usually, it's discussions of, the things that the Nazis were doing to the Jews, Poles, gypsies, gay people, and so on. We don't always hear about some of the resistance efforts, and I think they're kind of fascinating. Very interesting story, very inspirational. this guy Witold Pilecki, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. A fantastic book about him called The Volunteer, One Man, an Underground Army and the Secret Mission to Destroy Auschwitz. I believe there's a documentary that's either come out about him or will be coming out soon. But so he was a Polish military officer who fought the Nazis when they invaded Poland. Then he became part of the Polish resistance, the Polish underground, and as part of that, he infiltrated Auschwitz. He let himself be captured there, and from 1941 to 1943, he wrote reports and was able to smuggle them out. In one of his reports one of the first reports to Great Britain, it was after the mass killings had begun, and he started to realize, this isn't just some labor camp or something like that. This is, they're gassing people here. And so he sent a letter to Great Britain, and he basically said, just bomb the camps, just fly over the camps and bomb them. He would be killed too, but he was basically saying, the bombing would be a much more humane way to die than what's happening here in these camps. And so he eventually escaped. It's a pretty wild story, and like I said, very inspirational. So he escapes in 1945. World War II ends. Germany is defeated, but now the Soviet Union occupies Poland, and Pilecki didn't like that. It's just he didn't like the idea of trading out the Nazis for the Soviets. So he, was against them too, and they arrested him, and in 1947 they tortured him and then executed him. So anyway, he made it out of Auschwitz, but didn't make it out of the Soviet torture facility. Anyway, as I said, very inspirational story. The Second World War, why it's so important for the international order, is that it really kind of set up this idea of states being able to commit crimes, war crimes and things like this. So, the idea of war crimes had been discussed, and there were some laws regarding it, but the Second World War just brought so many, there was just so much violence of various different kinds that it set up, a new system of how countries could interact with one another. And they also looked at the crimes that countries can commit that are beyond just regular war, just war, and go into genocidal conflict and so on. So the Nuremberg trials looked at many of the Nazis. A famous book called Eichmann in Jerusalem. Eichmann was one of the leaders of the concentration camp, managers or whatever. And you'll sometimes hear the word or concept little Eichmanns, basically meaning people who just follow orders without thinking about them. That was kind of Eichmann's defense. Now, the other sort of major totalitarian violent movement in the 20th century was the Soviet Union, was communism in China and in the Soviet Union, as well as elsewhere around the world. So if you remember, we talked about millenarian movements last time, this idea that the world is going to change, and everything is going to there's going to be some big event that happens, and then the world's going to change. I think we talked about that last time. If not, we will be talking about it a little bit later. But okay. Pretty sure I talked to. Yes, I did. Okay. Yeah. So this book actually argues that the Soviet Bolshevik movement, which was the communist, they're basically a millenarian movement. They thought that, once there would be the successful revolution, the overthrow of the monarchy, the world would change and you would have this, new perfect communist society. And this book is fascinating because it looks at a lot of letters and diaries and so on. And, you hear people thinking that, this revolution is going to lead to, just a perfect world, essentially. So we can consider this an eschatological movement, basically an end times movement, overthrow the government, peace and harmony after that. But what we actually saw was that the secret police, called the Cheka, grew dramatically after the communists took power. The number of executions increased dramatically from what it had been under the Tsar and under the monarchy. And it begins with Lenin, as we talked about last time, but it really accelerates with Stalin. And Stalin basically imposes famine on Ukraine and other parts of Russia and Siberia. The book Animal Farm by George Orwell is based on this. A more humorous look at Stalin's time as the death of Stalin. But the Great Purge was this huge purge of society. Anyone who was thought to be not a revolutionary or not revolutionary enough or not loyal or so on were executed. And as I said, there was a famine that was essentially pushed upon Ukraine. And there's a fantastic movie based on a true story about it that came out 2020 or 2019 called Mr. Jones, about this guy Gareth Jones, who was a British reporter, went to Ukraine, went to Russia, kind of snuck over to Ukraine, saw what was happening there. As you can see here, there's people with heads. People had to resort to cannibalism. You had a huge famine. There's a great book on it called Stalin's War on Ukraine. Called Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. And it was Gareth Jones who uncovered this. Now, a lot of the sort of liberal press and liberal academics at the time, they wanted communism to succeed. So they were kind of, trying to cover up the atrocities that were happening in Ukraine. And Gareth Jones, courageously uncovered what was going on there. And later on, a few years later, he was on some other assignment in Mongolia, and he was murdered by supposedly bandits. It turns out his interpreter was the brother of someone in the Russian secret police, so pretty sure that it was probably Soviet secret police that ended up killing him. But fantastic movie about it. So other kind of along that lines, Arthur Koestler, who was Polish, he wrote a number of books. Darkness at Noon is one about believing in communism, but then, realizing it's this totalitarian nightmare. And he says, I went to communism and as one goes to a spring of fresh water, and I left communism as one clambers out of a poisoned river strewn with the wreckage of flooded cities and the corpses of the drowned. Rather dramatic. He says, our press and our schools cultivate chauvinism, militarism, dogmatism, etc. The arbitrary power of the government is unlimited, etc., etc., etc. And then he says, we whip the groaning masses of the country toward a theoretical future happiness, which only we can. So basically, it's kind of this story of someone believing in this ideology that then eventually kind of falls apart and becomes problematic. So we talked about just war last time. Talk about a couple of different ideas and theories and kind of take this somewhere. Democratic peace theory is this idea that democratic nations don't go to war with each other, or are much less likely to. And there's also the McDonald's thesis by the New York Times writer Thomas Friedman. No two countries that have a McDonald's have ever fought a war against each other. That's actually not true. You don't need to write this down or know this, but there was actually, there have been wars where two countries with McDonald's have fought each other. But generally speaking, we don't see democracies fight each other as much. Now, having said that, that's what a lot of people said before the First World War, and then you saw a number of countries, go to war that were democratic. So it doesn't always necessarily work out that way. I'm going to go through these a little quickly, but basically today, the major fears immediately don't seem to be nuclear weaponry. However, I know many analysts who would disagree with that, who say that we're closer to nuclear conflict than we ever were in the 20th century because we live in sort of a multipolar world. There's different powers and they have different weaponry and different interests. It's not neatly divided between American capitalism, democracy, and Soviet communism. So we see a lot of the conflict today is actually taking place with small arms, light weapons, such as automatic weapons, submachine guns, grenades, that sort of thing. Lots of weapons in the world. An important document, some of you may go into international law and work on some of this stuff, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was signed on December 10th, 1948. I'm not going to read this, but if you're interested, you can go through it. This is basically, it's kind of it's something we try to achieve. The world just, doesn't necessarily, doesn't live up to its expectations on this, but it is sort of a document that's kind of in some ways based on the the Rights of Man from the French Revolution, as well as the Declaration of Independence in the United States and other similar documents. When we look at conflict, and we need to recognize that most conflicts are resolved not through violent means, but through mediation or arbitration. Mediation means that there's a third party that comes in and is able to bring the two warring parties together. We see this, the United States does this frequently, has done this frequently. You see this happening in the Middle East too, sometimes with various countries where one will play a mediating role. Arbitration also involves a third party who then essentially makes the decision, acts like a judge, but for the two countries. Not just facilitates their meeting, but actually judges them. So after the Second World War, Europe was in rubble, most of East Asia was destroyed, and so you get the development of these different organizations to try to prevent conflict like that from happening again. So the United Nations is probably the best example of this, but they're still sort of biased towards that pre-World War II world, where some countries like Britain probably have more say than in international relations because of this than they might otherwise. So countries like China don't have as much influence as perhaps they should, given how powerful they are. So, as I say here, the failed COVID response by the U.S. will probably mean that China is going to become more influential. So the system that a lot of Western Europe and the United States adopted were ideas by John Maynard Keynes about government involvement in the economy, basically arguing that, at times of Great Depression or breakdown, then the government should get involved, subsidize things, that sort of thing. So the big stimulus that the Biden administration is passing for the COVID relief plan, that's we would call it a Keynesian policy for John Maynard Keynes. It's the sort of thing that he would have advocated. Well, as I said, the world was neatly divided between communist and capitalist during the 20th century. And, it did a lot to shape the world. And it also led in the United States to the development of the military-industrial complex. So this was a term developed by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been a general. He saw the continued buildup of military forces in the United States as something that was problematic. And he actually, not a lot of people know this, but the original term was the military-industrial congressional complex, because he wanted to point out that Congress plays a big role. So think about it this way. There's some, bomber, some plane that drops bombs that's maybe obsolete, not necessarily going to be used in the conflicts of the 21st century. So the government wants to cut it out, but then, so the administration announces they're going to cut this program, but then a bunch of senators come and say, we have constituents who make the tires for that in Ohio, and we have, constituents who work to make the seats for that in Seattle or something like this. So you have different parts of the equipment made in different parts of the country, employing thousands of people. So America actually ends up building a lot of stuff we don't really need, just because otherwise all these people would go unemployed, and these members of Congress would lose their jobs and that sort of thing. So Dwight D. Eisenhower was told by his staff to leave out the word congressional because they didn't want a conflict happening between the different branches of government. Very interesting. Not a lot of people know about that. One interesting place that I used to follow to get information about geopolitics was Stratforum, which was started by this guy George Friedman. He had a very interesting book that came out in 2008 called The Next 100 Years, where he looks at power. He says that the United States is will become a more powerful empire, but that does not mean that we'll become a more prosperous nation. It could be the exact opposite. Our standard of living is likely to decline while military power grows, is basically what his analysis was. He wrote this in 2008. He also said that Russia will basically make a comeback and will become resurgent again, and that the 21st century may not be marked by the U.S. versus China and that Thucydides trap, but a return to sort of a U.S. versus Russia stance. Now, with the Trump administration, was famously and curiously close to Putin and Russia, and the Biden administration has a very different approach. Now, what I think is very interesting about Friedman's analysis is that he was right. Russia has become more resurgent since 2008. They invaded Georgia. That's not Georgia down south. That's Georgia in Russia, or near Russia. And 2014, they invaded Ukraine and annexed part of the country. And as we know, they've been very active in hacking campaigns and disinformation campaigns in American elections as well as in European elections. So I think Friedman was onto something there. What he didn't really talk about was, or what he, I think, failed to realize was the rise of white supremacy, which is what these symbols are here. And I kind of like this image because it kind of shows a lot of the things that are leading some young, mostly white men to go into fascist, racialist movements. Everything from the growing spread of the Islamic religion, ancient hatreds and anti-Semitism, that sort of thing, homophobia, and so on and so forth. So a lot of things, a lot of ways in which society is changing and leading to, big changes amongst people's beliefs as well. Daniel Thoreau, if you remember, we talked about him in Tyrants last time. He says that the world is basically going through this process of retribalization. And he has these 5 levels of ethnic conflict. Multi-ethnic societies without conflict, Switzerland, multi-ethnic societies with controlled conflict like the United States, societies with ethnic conflict that has been resolved, South Africa, Rwanda, for example, societies with serious ethnic conflict leading to war, Sri Lanka, societies with genocidal conflict, ethnic cleansing such as Darfur, and I'll talk about that on Monday. I spend many years of my life thinking about Darfur every single day. Okay. So again, just a reminder, millenarianism, this idea that there's going to be some huge change, some transformation of society after some great event. Now, as I said last time, John Gray kind of says, Soviet communism is like this, Nazism is, Islamic jihadism, radical Zionism, all of these movements that basically believe in, some event or something happening that will, bring about, some sort of major change. In the book by John Gray, he wrote in about 2007, he talks about the American neoconservative movement. That's this kind of defunct organization now called the Project for the New American Century. And this was this idea that they could spread democracy, by taking out dictators. And that was this kind of millenarian belief that, once you toppled Saddam Hussein, you just have this wonderful, peaceful democracy afterward. And it failed miserably, as we all know. And it's mostly dead. Nobody is, making that argument anymore. But it was, as I said, a millenarian movement. Now, there's this idea that's growing in, I guess, popularity called accelerationism. And this is this idea that capitalism and technological change should be accelerated, speeded up. And the reason, though, is because it's this idea that there's no other alternative, that basically you just need to accelerate the process of capitalism because it will lead to its own collapse. And it will also lead to the collapse of liberal democracy. And then, people can create a new system. So it's associated with this guy named Nick Land, kind of an interesting character who was writing about this in the 1990s. Now he lives in China, kind of an authoritarian-minded person. But anyway, the idea here is that capitalism, there's nothing you can do about it other than just hope it accelerates, and then it'll break, crush the system, and then it will, lead to, a whole new world. So it's a perfect example of a millenarian movement. So, it's kind of, to me, it seems naive. It's just like any millenarian movement of the past, like communism or anything else. There's going to be, we'll just accelerate capitalism and then it'll collapse, and out of it will emerge something better. I think that kind of thinking is very dangerous. It's what, caused most of the big atrocities of the 20th century. And somewhat related to that is QAnon. As I said, QAnon is also a perfect example of a millenarian movement. Just a reminder of how many people actually believe in this. Large percentage of the American population, and a very large percentage of the Republican Party, of the current Republican Party. And we know that there was January 6th was supposed to be that event. There was, many, if you look at the interviews with people there, many of them attended believing that there was going to be that Trump was going to announce the arrests of, many Democrats and this supposed cabal of child molesters that is in the Democratic Party and so on, and that conspiracy theory that's part of QAnon. And they thought that, everything was going to change. And then, they went to the Capitol, attacked the Capitol. Oops, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to say, and you can look and you can find all sorts of stuff online about, various different aspects of QAnon. I'll have a link. You can watch stuff about it too. But it was different than most protests. It was much different than the Black Lives Matter protests that were in Washington last summer, as the police who were attacked have said. And as you see here, they were attacked pretty violently. The protesters, the insurrectionists, have built essentially a gallows with a rope, and the idea was that, I guess, all the traitors that supposedly stole the election from Trump were going to be murdered. But it's important to recognize this is all a delusion. This is all completely wrong, and it's started from an online misinformation campaign. It'll be very interesting to see at some point who started it, which I think at some point we'll probably know. But what's fascinating from a sociological perspective is, why does this happen? How did people go into that mindset? As we talked about before, the masses basically, sometimes when you're in a crowd, you sort of lose your individuality and join the group. We call it the de-individuation. A reduced sense of individual identity, accompanied by diminished self-regulation. Basically, you do what everyone else is doing. That's why you see people who probably were smarter than to know in normal circumstances, to know that you don't smash the windows through, attack police and smash windows and invade the Capitol without serious consequences. But when you're in a big mob like that, you're in sort of a de-individuated state. One way in which this has been tested is what's called suicide baiting. So when crowds of people begin encouraging someone to commit suicide, like, I'm going to kill myself, please do, nobody would miss you. One analysis looked at newspaper reports. They found it was twice as likely to occur with a large crowd and 4 times as likely to occur at night. So people are yelling, jump, and they're more likely to do that when, they're not recognizable and so on. And you can look at this, crowd size, and after 6 p.m. people, when they're more likely to be anonymous, they're more likely to say those things, kind of like trolls online, as we talked about. As I said, we'll probably talk about terrorism. It's more on Monday, but just to kind of go over this, transnational terrorism looks at terrorist acts between different countries. Domestic terrorism would be January 6th, the attack on the Capitol, where it's coming from within the society. You can read this on your own time. I'm not going to go over this in detail. This kind of goes through the different ways that people join some of these movements. Again, one of the things that they found in amongst a lot of the insurrectionists at the Capitol was a huge percentage of them had financial problems, which actually is not the case for the majority of Trump voters. So you have various symbols, fascist symbols coming back. This symbol right here was kind of interesting because the stage at the Conservative Political Action Committee, CPAC stage, was actually had a stage that was in this symbol that many people pointed out. It seems very strange that that's just coincidence, but I don't know. So today, right now in the United States and Western countries, the biggest terrorist threat isn't jihadists anymore. It's becoming right-wing extremists. When I used to teach this class, over the last 15 years, it was primarily jihadist terrorism that we would focus on. Now we're focusing more on domestic right-wing terrorism. And as you can see here, it goes far beyond what radical Islamic extremists have done. You can look at the different attacks by right-wing terrorist attacks. Now, I do want to say, there's nothing inherent about, right-wing groups that make them more violent than left-wing groups. It's, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, you can find many more examples of left-wing terrorist groups. And I'll have a video about a documentary about one group called the Weather Underground. So back then, you had more violent left-wing groups. Today, you have more violent right-wing groups. So anyway, that's where that is, essentially. So this is looking at various different conflicts. And, again, looking at some of the other ones. I was actually in Isla Vista in Santa Barbara, California when this happened. My wife and I heard the shots. A guy, I guess, hated women, and, he was what we now call an incel, an involuntary celibate, and he tried to kill a number of women at a sorority house. The door was locked, so he just started shooting around, killed 6 and wounded 14 people. So as I said, you can look at the different different, wrap this up very quickly. You can look at the different weapons that people use, look at who they're targeting. As I said, we'll talk about war. We'll finish up on Monday, but we'll also talk about how war is actually declining. So there is some good news there. And I'll just leave it with this image today, since we talked about kind of depressing stuff. So all right, well, everyone, have a good weekend.